From New York, this is Democracy Now!
If the Israeli government can deport somebody documenting rights abuse without facing consequence, how can we ever stop rights abuse?
Israel deports the head of Human Rights Watch's Israel and Palestine office in the latest crackdown on dissent inside Israel. We'll speak to Omar Shakir, now in Stockholm, about his deportation and what it means for the future of human rights work in Israel. Then to Iraq, where more than 340 people have been killed since nationwide anti-government protests began in October.
We as students in Basra and across Iraq continue with our protests. Now we are in the 5th week of the student strike. We will continue to protest until we overthrow the regime and dissolve parliament, and until all the political class resigns and the election law is changed.
We'll speak to the Iraqi poet and novelist, scholar Sinan Antoon. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A federal judge has ruled President Trump cannot block top White House officials from testifying in the ongoing impeachment hearings. The judge's reasoning, stated simply, the primary takeaway from the past 250 years of recorded American history is that presidents are not kings, she said. Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's ruling says former White House counsel Don McGahn must comply with a congressional subpoena and testify to impeachment investigators about President Trump's efforts to obstruct the Mueller inquiry. The Justice Department says it will appeal the decision. The ruling could have a sweeping impact on the impeachment hearings, where a number of top officials, including former National Security Advisor John Bolton, have so far refused to testify. Meanwhile, federal prosecutors appear to be widening the probe into Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani. The Wall Street Journal reports recently issued subpoenas for people with ties to Giuliani suggest prosecutors may be investigating possible money laundering, obstruction of justice, and campaign finance violations. The Supreme Court has temporarily blocked a lower court ruling that would have required President Trump's accounting firm to release his financial records to the House Oversight and Reform Committee. The Supreme Court will now decide whether it'll hear the case, which could set a major precedent about the balance of power between Congress and the executive branch. In northern Syria, U.S. troops have resumed combat missions against ISIS militants 2 months after President Trump threw the region into turmoil by abruptly announcing the withdrawal of all U.S. troops from northern Syria, clearing the way for the Turkish ground invasion. Despite Trump's claims he was bringing the troops home, some soldiers were moved to Iraq, while others stayed in northern Syria to guard oil fields. Now the Pentagon says it's resuming combat operations against ISIS. At least 500 U.S. soldiers are currently deployed to Syria, many of them in combat roles. The United Nations says greenhouse gas emissions surged to record high levels last year. The new report also says the increase in methane levels in 2018 was the highest increase in the last 20 years. Methane's an extremely powerful greenhouse gas. This is the World Meteorologist Organization's Secretary General, Petteri Talas.
Last year we have seen emission growth continued. It has been growing for the past 2 years, and the estimate for last year was 2.1% increase. So despite the Paris Agreement, the emissions are still growing.
In Kenya, at least 56 people have died in landslides near the Ugandan border. The landslides were triggered by unusually heavy rains. Increased rainfall rates have been linked to climate change. Leaked documents have shed new light on China's government's network of prison camps in the far western region of Xinjiang, where as many as 1 million Uyghur Muslims have been detained without trial. The Chinese government says these prisons offer voluntary education, but the leaked documents reveal a campaign to force prisoners to change their language, culture, and religious beliefs. British human rights lawyer Ben Emerson said, quote, "It is very difficult to view that as anything other than a mass brainwashing scheme designed and directed at an entire ethnic community," unquote. Chinese government has denied carrying out any human rights violations against the Uyghurs. Colombian President Iván Duque has called for a national dialogue as massive protests continue to rock the country following last week's general strike. The demonstrations began as a protest against corruption, economic inequality, and the killing of indigenous and community leaders. Many are now calling for the ouster of Duque's right-wing government. Protesters around the world took to the streets Monday to protest violence against women. Crowds poured into the streets in Spain, Guatemala, Russia, Sudan, Turkey, South Africa, Bulgaria, France, Chile, Colombia, El Salvador and beyond to mark the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. This is one of the protesters in Mexico City.
People suffer daily. They assault us, they rob from us, they kidnap us, they rape us, they kill us, and the authorities don't even care. I beg you, have a little empathy. Put yourself in our shoes. They're killing us. It hurts us. You don't even realize. Make laws that are just. Death to the rapists. There's no other way.
In Argentina, 2 Catholic priests were sentenced to over 4 decades in prison Monday for sexually abusing and raping dozens of students with hearing disabilities at an institute in the city of Mendoza. One of the priests had previously been investigated for sexual abuse at a school in his home country of Italy in the 70s, but was not convicted at the time. A former gardener of the school in Argentina was also convicted for sexual abuse crimes that were reported by over 20 alumni and took place between 2004 and 2016. In Minnesota, at least 30 water protectors blockaded the entrance of the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline Monday morning. The proposed controversial pipeline would carry tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada, to a terminal in Superior, Wisconsin. Its path would cut through Minnesota, where Indigenous communities have been fighting its construction, saying the pipeline would violate tribal sovereignty and contaminate the land and water. In Baltimore, Maryland, 3 men who were wrongfully imprisoned in 1983 have walked free from prison after spending 36 years behind bars for a crime they did not commit. Alfred Chestnut, Ransom Watkins, and Andrew Stewart were arrested and jailed on charges of shooting 14-year-old DeWitt Duckett in the hallway of Baltimore's Harlem Park Junior High School, allegedly because they wanted to steal his jacket. The 3 African-American teenagers always maintained their innocence. Now in their 50s, the 3 men were released Monday after a review of the case revealed multiple errors, including the fact that the state's attorney lied about the evidence and that the police pressured teenage witnesses. Google has fired 4 employees who've been active in labor organizing inside the tech giant. One of the fired workers, Rebecca Rivers, had objected to Google's bid to collaborate with CBP, that's Customs and Border Protection. Another one of the fired workers, Lawrence Berland, had protested hate speech on YouTube, which is owned by Google. The company claims all 4 workers were fired for violations of Google's data security policies. And Attorney General William Barr announced a nationwide plan to address the crisis of missing and murdered Native American women Friday during a visit to the Flathead Reservation in Montana, which has suffered high rates of violence against Indigenous women and girls. The Justice Department's new initiative would invest $1.5 million to hire specialized coordinators in 11 U.S. attorneys' offices that have a large number of caseloads from Native American reservations. The coordinators would be responsible for developing protocols to improve the response of law enforcement in missing people cases. For years, Indigenous activists have been protesting the high levels of violence against Indigenous women and girls. Many have called for the restoration of tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Native Americans who commit crimes on tribal land. This is Mary Catherine Nagel, an attorney and citizen of Cherokee Nation, speaking on Democracy Now!
In 1978, the United States Supreme Court took away tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. And as the United States Department of Justice has reported, unfortunately, the majority of violent crimes against our Native women are committed by non-Indians. And so that means that, quite often our tribal governments, their hands are tied because of the legal framework the federal government has put in place.
Native American women experience some of the highest rates of murder, sexual violence, and domestic abuse nationwide, with several federal studies showing Indigenous women are killed at a rate more than 10 times the national average. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. The Israeli government deported the head of Human Rights Watch's Israel and Palestine office, Omar Shakir, on Monday. The organization said the move places Israel in an ugly club of authoritarian regimes. Israel has accused Shakir of supporting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, a nonviolent global campaign aiming to pressure Israel over its treatment of Palestinians. A 2017 Israeli law bans foreigners from Israel if they publicly support the BDS movement. This is Omar Shakir speaking on Monday.
If the Israeli government can deport somebody documenting rights abuse without facing consequence, how can we ever stop rights abuse? We believe in the right to free expression, including the right of all people to call for boycotts or to oppose boycotts as a part of legitimate free expression.
The executive director of the human rights group B'Tselem, Haggai Elad, tweeted in response to Shakir's deportation, quote, "International and Israeli human rights NGOs have much broader leeway as we enjoy so many more privileges and protections compared to Palestinian colleagues. But in targeting HRW, Israel aims to deliver a chilling effect across this entire spectrum," he wrote. Well, for more, we go to Stockholm, Sweden, to speak with Omar Shakir, Israel and Palestine Director for Human Rights Watch. He was just deported and is now traveling around Europe to raise awareness about the Israeli human rights abuses. Omar Shakir, welcome to Democracy Now! Explain what happened and how long you have been in Israel and Palestine and what Israel did.
Thank you, Amy, for having me. The Israeli government for 2.5 years now has been trying to bar Human Rights Watch's access to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. It began actually with a denial for the organization to hire a foreign employee. When we went public with that effort, they quickly reversed and gave me a work permit, but almost immediately began investigating my status. And 1.5 years ago, they revoked that work permit. We challenged that decision in court. It was upheld up to the Israeli Supreme Court, and yesterday I was deported over my human rights advocacy.
And could you talk about that Supreme Court decision? What was the basis for it?
The Israeli Supreme Court essentially interpreted the 2017 law that you mentioned earlier that instructs the Interior Ministry to deny entry to boycott supporters to apply to rudimentary basic human rights advocacy. The Supreme Court, in essence, said that if you challenge the legality of Israel's settlements, which is a war crime under international law, which has been established over many decades, you, in essence, are attacking the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And as a result, you are harming Israel, posing a threat to the country, and that the state is legitimate to deny you entry and therefore deport you. So not only is Israel, which calls itself a democracy, deporting a human rights defender based on their peaceful advocacy, but actually they're even going a step further and acknowledging that they're doing it with the court's stamp of approval over human rights work based on international norms. Human Rights Watch has never taken a position on BDS. What we rather do is call on businesses, as we do across the world, to respect human rights. And decades of research has led us to conclude that businesses which operate in the illegal settlements invariably contribute to that illegality and to rights abuse. And we've asked for them to stop doing that, which is, of course, different than a more general boycott call, or even a boycott call specific to those companies or to Israel proper, which we've never done.
So give the example. For example, Airbnb, what did you call for them?
Sure. So a year ago, we released a report that documented the way in which Airbnb's listings in illegal settlements invariably contributed to rights abuse. They were renting properties on land stolen from Palestinians who themselves were not allowed to stay there. This is land in which Israeli settlers, received permits to build, where Palestinians are denied those permits. They also are operating, on land. In some cases where we were able to establish is privately owned by Palestinians who themselves can't rent there or benefit from that rental. So we called on Airbnb to delist in settlements. We did not call for a boycott of Airbnb. We did not call for Airbnb to stop doing business inside Israel proper. We were holding Airbnb to the standards under the UN guiding principle, the same things we do, whether it be dealing dealing with cotton picking in Uzbekistan or tech companies in China, we call on all companies to respect international law, which is different than calling for them to boycott, Israel, or much less calling on consumers to boycott that company.
Now, has what happened to you, this deportation, happened previously to any Human Rights Watch researchers? And if so, were these countries democracies, as Israel claims to be?
So this is the first time that a country that, self-proclaims itself to be a democracy deports a Human Rights Watch staff member. And in barring access to our staff, Israel is joining the ranks of countries, like Venezuela, like Egypt, like Iran, that have barred access to Human Rights Watch staff members. Human Rights Watch has been documenting human rights abuses in Israel and in Palestine for nearly 3 decades now. And while Israel has restricted our access to the occupied Gaza Strip, we've had unfettered access for this time to Israel and the West Bank. This is the first time they've deported us. It's the first time anyone that had legal status in the country has been deported under this 2017 law. And of course, they're doing so in a way that is aimed to send a chilling message to other rights organizations.
Human Rights Watch Executive Director Kenneth Roth criticized Israel's decision to expel you, Omar Shakir.
It's not about it's about Human Rights Watch. There's no point replacing Omar because our next researcher would have the exact same problem that Omar did. If Israel can pick our researcher, if Israel can preclude certain topics, imagine what other governments will do. China will say you cannot monitor Xinjiang. Saudi Arabia will say you've got to leave Yemen alone.
If you could take that from there, Omar Shakir, and what you're planning to do right now.
Absolutely. I mean, Human Rights Watch, for us, this is a principled issue. We're not going to let any government have a veto power on what issues we work on or what we cover. So our message is quite simple. We will continue the work with me at the helm directing the research from one of our regional offices starting just across the river in Jordan. One of our regional offices, I should mention, that does not censor our work the way that Israel does, despite our criticism. So we're going to continue to work on the same issues, with the same intensity and the same vigor. And in fact, I think this sort of decision really pushed us to redouble our efforts, because a government that has no qualms about deporting a representative of one of the world's largest human rights organizations certainly has no problem doubling down on the rights abuse that we were documenting in the first place. A half-century-long occupation defined by institutional discrimination and systematic rights abuse, and including what's happening in the Gaza Strip, a decade-long plus closure that includes a generalized ban on travel, nobody in, nobody out, outside of exceptional circumstances. So while, this decision certainly has been difficult, on a personal level, Israel-Palestine has been my home for the last 2.5 years. I think about those that are not able to travel at all, not just the people of Gaza, but my colleague at Amnesty International, who just a few weeks ago was issued a ban to leave the occupied West Bank to Jordan and previously to Jerusalem on undisclosed security grounds. What appears to be another attempt to stifle the work of human rights organizations.
Let me go to that issue of the Amnesty researcher. In October, Israel issued a travel ban against Laith Abu Zayad, a Palestinian campaigner for Amnesty. Israel prevented him from departing from the West Bank for Jordan, where he was planning to attend a relative's funeral. Israel also denied entry to Congress members Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, later granting permission for Congressmember Tlaib to visit her family in the occupied West Bank on humanitarian grounds, but she rejected the offer, which included the condition she not promote the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Israel's also issued a series of travel bans against Omar Barghouti, the founder of BDS movement, and Shawan Jabarin, the director of the Palestinian rights organization Al-Haq. Can you comment on these?
Absolutely. I mean, this decision is coming amid a context in which there is a systematic assault on human rights organizations. And there's a reason why the Israeli government is doing this. They are trying to silence the messenger instead of dealing with the core human rights issues that are taking place on the ground. But the reality is that these efforts are failing. These efforts have only shined a light on the very issues that Israel is trying to cover up. But, of course, what's happening to me must be noted is small compared to what Palestinians face. In addition to Laith's travel ban that you mentioned, in recent months we've seen Al-Damir, a Palestinian prisoner rights organization, have their office raided by the army. We've seen a field researcher with Beit Salem who was detained while doing field work. And, of course, if this is the way that human rights organizations are being dealt with, think about the millions of Palestinians in year 53 of an ugly occupation, which they regularly face excessive use of force, home demolitions, movement restrictions that are discriminatory, not to mention not having the most basic civil and political rights. A 50-year-old Palestinian today in the West Bank has never had the right to free expression, the right to free assembly, the right to free association. They've been living under a brutal military rule that the Israeli government wants the world to forget about, but we won't forget about it.
I wanted to ask you, both the European Union and the United Nations have condemned this action by Israel, but of course Israel routinely ignores such condemnation from those international bodies. What about the United States government? Where is it right now on this? And could it have potentially an impact in terms of this kinds of actions of Israel against human rights advocates?
The United States has never used its leverage to actually, rein in Israeli rights abuse. But what we've seen under the Trump administration is a shift to green lighting, Israeli abuses and really being complicit in them. In my case, of course, the U.S. Embassy attended each one of my court hearings up to the U.S. Supreme Court on a working level. We had a regular conversation. The State Department did make a statement, over the summer indicating their support for free expression and they're concerned about the case and such. But obviously we didn't see the same kind of strong principled position in protecting the work of civil society groups that we saw from a range of other governments around the world, including, the European Union, but also, Germany, France, many others, as well as civil society groups, not only Palestinian and Israeli, but international, including groups, Jewish American organizations. So the reality here is the United States, whether it be on settlements with the declaration by Pompeo recently, whether it be on Palestinian refugees, or whether it be on protection of human rights defenders, the increasing, relationship between the Netanyahu and Trump administrations only highlights their isolation, because in every other case, the world has stood around the principled issue. The world sees through my deportation and sees it for what it is, an attack on the human rights movement.
Finally, in a sharp reversal to more than 40 years of U.S. policy, the Trump administration announced earlier this month that no longer views Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank to be a violation of international law. In 1978, the State Department issued a legal opinion stating settlements were, quote, inconsistent with international law, and every U.S. administration, Democratic and Republican, has upheld that. In 2016, a UN resolution declared the settlements a flagrant violation of international law. But now Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has announced a reversal in the U.S. position. Israel's embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's now been indicted, welcomed Pompeo's announcement as a historic day for Israel. I wanted to play the clip of Palestinian Chief Negotiator Saeb Erekat condemning the U.S. decision.
Israeli colonial settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, are not only illegal under international law, they are war crimes. Once the Trump administration decide to undermine international law, once they become an administration that's pro-Israel's occupation, pro-Israel war crimes, this constitute a major threat to international peace and security.
So that's Saeb Erekat, Palestinian negotiator. Omar Shakir, your final response.
Look, I think the U.S. declaration is a sign of their weakness and their irrelevance. The reality is Trump cannot change decades of established international law that settlements are war crime by decree, as much as he may want to. This is not a controversial point. The Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention makes clear that transfer of one's civilian population to territory acquired by war is impermissible. And it's quite clear that, Israel wants to have its cake and eat it too. On one hand, it wants to say that settlements in the West, are not illegal, and in some cases even saying that the West Bank is not occupied. But on the other hand, they don't want to give Palestinians the human rights that they would deserve, including the right to have, full political rights in that kind of arrangement. What we're facing is the increasingly clear reality today. Between the river and the sea, so in the land of Israel and Palestine, you have about 13 million people, about half of whom are Israeli Jewish and half of whom are Palestinian. And Palestinians are treated fundamentally unequally, with different sets of inferior rights, whether they're in Gaza, the West Bank, or in Israel proper. That reality has become increasingly transparent, and the world needs to take action to stop that. If anything is clear, the fact that international outrage did not stop my deportation should make critically clear that the only way we're going to be able to stop these abuses from continuing is going to be action and heightened action from the international community. I will continue to do this in my role at Human Rights Watch, and we'll continue to do it with our Israeli and Palestinian partners. And I'm confident that I will be back to Israel and Palestine one day. And when that day comes, I believe it'll be a day in which human rights and equality is the baseline for all people that live in the land, not what it is now, exclusive to only one population.
Omar Shakir, we want to thank you so much for being with us, Israel and Palestine Director for Human Rights Watch, who was just deported from Israel, speaking to us from Stockholm, Sweden, where we'll be broadcasting next week. When we come back, more than 340 people in Iraq have been killed since nationwide anti-government protests began in October. We'll speak with the Iraqi poet, novelist, scholar Sinan Antoon. Stay with us. Palestinian musician Camille Gibran. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to Iraq, where more than 340 people have died since anti-government protests began in early October. More than 15,000 Iraqis have been injured. On Monday, tires were set on fire and main roads and bridges were blocked in the cities of Basra and Nasiriyah. Over the weekend, security forces opened fire on civilians in Baghdad and other cities. The demonstrators are protesting corruption and lack of jobs and basic services, including clean water and electricity. Falah Hassan took part in the protests in Basra.
Our protests are peaceful. We are taking to the streets to take our rights back. We will never surrender, neither today, tomorrow, nor even after 1 year. By doing so, the authorities make themselves tired. The security forces are our sons, our cousins, and our brothers. Why do they hit us? Whenever they get out of their vehicle, they open fire on us.
In Baghdad, many university students are taking part in the demonstrations.
When we are protesting, we don't aim to dirty or destroy streets. Our goal is to achieve our demands and to live in a homeland with peace and security. God willing, and with the determination of our brothers, the protesters, we will achieve our aspirations. We are university students. We left college and joined the protesters. God willing, we will have success.
To talk more about the protests in Iraq, we're joined by the Iraqi poet, novelist, translator, scholar Sinan Antoon. He was born and raised in Baghdad, now an associate professor at New York University here in the city. His most recent novel, The Book of Collateral Damage. Sinan, it's great to have you with us. 340 Iraqi protesters dead right now since the protests have just recently begun. Can you talk about the situation there? Talk about the level of violence and also talk about what are the demands. What caused this latest round of protests?
I mean, this started out in October, on the first day of October, and unlike previous waves of protests in October 1st, they were very spontaneous and mostly from the working class, impoverished neighborhoods in Baghdad. And the unprecedented lethal response of the regime by killing many of these peaceful protesters fueled the anger of so many other Iraqis who then came out in bigger waves, especially on the 25th of October. And what has started out as a protest from a certain class and group of people has become now really widespread in that so many different sectors have joined these protests. It's unprecedented in the modern history of Iraq that so many people from so many different backgrounds come together for this set of demands, and it's basically the culmination of 16 years of corruption and inefficiency and failure on the part of the political class to deliver anything, basic services, as you mentioned. And so the demands now are that the dissolution of the parliament, that there should be a new election law, that there should be a new constitution that is drafted. These are the demands, and unfortunately and not surprisingly, the regime has not really responded except with violence and death, and it doesn't seem to understand the level of seriousness. It's also a huge gap in so many ways between the political elite ensconced in the green zone, living their luxurious life, and the rest of Iraqi society, which lives outside. It's also a generational gap. I mean, Iraq is a very young population, and the great majority of these protesters are people who were born in the 90s and who have only seen the corruption and the failure of this political elite, even its inability to protect its citizens and what happened with ISIS occupation and so on and so forth. But what's really important is the reclaiming of Iraqi identity and a new sense of Iraqi nationalism that transcends the sectarian discourse that was institutionalized by the United States in 2003, and that so many of these political parties used to maintain their power over large sectors of society. So many Iraqis, despite the death and the pain, so many Iraqis are really hopeful to see the creativity and the resilience of these protesters and what they're doing all across Iraq in these sites where they are trying to reinvent the meaning of the country, but also in their ability to, for example, in Tahrir Square, to transform this place, which has been the buildings and the tunnel and this square that is so important symbolically, was completely ignored. And they have managed to clean up the place, to use art, to cover the walls with graffiti that represents unity and hope, to start a cinema inside Tahrir Square. So it has, I mean, the main slogan that started these protests was, "We want a homeland," which is very simple yet is very powerful, which reflects that the political class and the system that was installed after the occupation has failed to give citizens any sense of meaning or to deliver any services. So, and sadly, I mean, as the time goes by, the regime's forces and the militias continue to kill these peaceful demonstrators.
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the efforts of the young protesters to go beyond the ethnic and religious divisions that have been exploited by the political class now, whether it's Sunni or Shiite or Kurdish or Israeli. I wanted to. The United States also has emphasized for so long first the threat of Saddam Hussein, then ISIS, and of course always of Iran, as Iran being the great threat behind what's the problems besetting the Iraqi people. Could you talk about the impact of this continued U.S. effort to demonize particular groups in the Iraqi in the world of the Iraqi population?
Well, I mean, Iran has so much influence inside Iraq and has infiltrated so many of the institutions and backs so many of these militias, but all of that is a product of the U.S. occupation and invasion of Iraq. So while Iran is one of the targets of these protesters, but it's important to remember that a lot of the signs and the placards that the protesters have in Tahrir Square and elsewhere say no to any foreign intervention. So they say no to Iran, no to Turkey, no to Israel, and no to the United States. But of course, the United States, because of its geopolitical interest and its ongoing confrontation with Iran in so many countries, focuses only on this one dimension, which is Iran. No one denies that Iran backs many of these parties in Iraq, financially and otherwise, and has infiltrated, as I've said, Iraqi society in so many ways. But of course, there are all of these other dimensions. And sadly, mainstream media in this country and even in Europe is very myopic and only sees in these protests that they are against Iran and they are a threat to Iran and its influences of the regime, of course. And that's true. But Iraqis want to reclaim a country and they want sovereignty and they're against all types of interventions. And Iraq, since 2003, is a field that is the state is very weak in a way, and we have Turkish troops in Iraq in the north, we have American troops, and so the protesters are really very conscientious of all of this, and they really have a deep understanding, at least judging from what they say when they appear on the media, of that, the interest of Iraq and Iraqis come first, and sovereignty is very important. Of course, it's not going to be taken back overnight, but they realize that the Iranian regime is not the only threat and not the only sponsor of certain forces inside Iraq.
I'd like to turn to Vice President Mike Pence, who made a surprise visit to Iraq this weekend.
With regard to our conversations with Prime Minister al-Mahdi, we spoke about the unrest that's been taking place in recent weeks here in Iraq. He assured me that they were working to avoid violence or the kind of repression that we see taking place even as we speak in Iran. And he pledged to me that they would work to protect and respect peaceful protesters as a part of the democratic process here in Iraq.
So that's Vice President Pence and that surprise visit. Your response to what he said about Iraq, about the protests, and also President Trump said he's pulling troops out of the area when he was talking about Syria, and then it turns out he was putting them into Iraq.
Look, this is the language that a lot of these protests are also going out against. Pence calls it the democratic process, and this is the real hoax, actually, in Iraq since 2003. Using the term democratic process, what has this democratic process brought to Iraqis? $650 billion has disappeared from the coffers. And this is a very rich country. And, Pence calls it unrest. And it's not really unrest. These are peaceful protests that are being killed. So this language is meaningless. Neither Pence nor Trump has any credibility in Iraq or in the region, nor does the U.S. administration. It has a very long established history of supporting dictators and dictatorship and rehabilitating. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is just one example. So, of course, the U.S. is in a way in collusion with the Iraqi regime. And so none of this really matters to the protesters on the ground. They are resilient, and they're going to wait and try to snatch whatever is possible. But I want to say that irrespective of what happens, I think the new language that these protesters have reclaimed and the new sense of belonging is going to go on, and they're not going to give up on their demands no matter what the regional and the international response is. But, you know, I mean, there are always calls to save the Iraqi people, but most of these protesters realize that in a way they are alone. There is symbolic support internationally, but they know that neither the U.S. government nor any of the regional regimes are on their side.
You've mentioned a couple of times the changes since 2003, obviously, of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. The protesters now, the young protesters, were basically children at the time of that invasion. But the question of how the elders of Iraq, the older population, judged the difference between the society they had under the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, yet it was a modern and relatively well-off population compared to what the situation that has existed for the past 16 years.
I mean, it wasn't a well-off population. I mean, I think the problem, and one of the so many negative and disastrous effects of the U.S. occupation and installing this new regime is to push people to sometimes make these comparisons. I mean, and I don't think 2003 is the actual break, even though I use it myself. But we have to remember that in 1991, the first Gulf War after Saddam's invasion of Kuwait is really the moment when, to quote Jim Baker back then, he said, "We will return you to the pre-industrial age." So the degradation of Iraqi society in terms of its institutions and its infrastructure started out in 1991. And then we had the sanctions for so many years that really also further destroyed. It continued the war by other means, killing 1 million, driving 3 million out of the country. But what matters is to look at what 2003 had done. It was Act 3 in a very long process of dismantling the Iraqi state, irrespective of Saddam Hussein, destroying social fabric, not allowing the regime even to rebuild the country. That's what really matters. But I should say that the majority of these protesters, they are unencumbered by all of these old questions, and they really don't care much about comparisons between pre-2003 and post-2003. They want to live a good life in accordance with the resources that the country has. They know that the country is very rich in resources. They are well aware through social media, through their access to information, that this political class is a group of crooks. They know because there are so many scandals and there are numbers and figures, and that's what they really want. Actually, it's about the future. It's not about the past. What vision does this political class have for the country? Nothing.
Sinan Antoon, talk about the role of women in these protests.
Yes, I mean, women in Iraqi society have a long history that many people don't know. The first women minister in the entire region was actually in Iraq in 1959. So what's great about this wave of protests is that, as I said, so many people from all backgrounds are participating, and women from various generations, from various backgrounds are participating in the protests, are there not only in supportive roles, but really spearheading all of the efforts to stand, to defend the spots in these squares, and a sense of volunteerism and a sense of coming together. So I'm usually a pessimist, but what's really making me more optimistic about this is that it's really changing also the relationships between people of different backgrounds and making people come together for the country. So it's everywhere you look, you see women on the ground, you see women at the forefront, you see a change in the sense of people fighting against authority and against patriarchy. There are so many moving scenes. There was a scene of a young boy who was taken inside a police car for raising an Iraqi flag, and schoolgirls, from 9 or 10 years old, crowded around the police car and started protesting and chanting and forced the police to release this boy. So this is a new sense of empowerment that people feel, whether men or women, people of different generations, which is really amazing.
And also that there are very few of any of the political parties or regular organizations involved. It's to a large degree. Is it a leaderless uprising?
I mean, it is a leaderless uprising, and of course there have been attempts to hijack and infiltrate, and they're ongoing as we speak. But once again, the protesters have shown a sense of awareness, in that, for example, when the regime asked them to present a list of figures to negotiate with, they sent the names of the martyrs, the people who have died, saying these are our leaders. It's very poetic, but it's very powerful, which it means that unless they are held accountable for the crimes that they have committed, there will be no negotiation. Of course, this is a sense of strength, not having a leadership, but it's also, of course, tricky, because sooner or later there have to emerge a certain structure and a leadership to be able to translate these demands and to go on. But we don't know yet.
Well, we want to thank you, Sinan Antun, so much for being with us. Poet, novelist, translator, scholar, born and raised in Baghdad, now here in New York, an associate professor at New York University. His most recent novel, The Book of Collateral Damage. When we come back, we look at the life and legacy of Toni Morrison. Last week, literary luminaries, social leaders from around the country gathered in New York at Cathedral of St. John the Divine to honor her, including Oprah Winfrey. Stay with us.
واتب على الروح جيلنها لريحتكم حنينة وتقول لي لا تجينا لا تجينا لا تجينا.
Yearning by Bashar al-Azawi. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We want to turn to the incredible legacy of Toni Morrison. Last week, literary luminaries and social leaders from around the country gathered at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in Manhattan to honor Morrison, one of the nation's most influential writers. She died in August at the age of 88 from complications of pneumonia. In 1993, Morrison became the first African-American woman to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. She's also won a Pulitzer Prize in 1988 for her classic work, Beloved. Much of Morrison's writing focused on the black female experience in America, and her writing style honored the rhythms of black oral tradition.
In 2012, President Obama awarded Toni Morrison the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Well, at St. John the Divine, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Edwidge Danticat, and Oprah Winfrey were among those who spoke about Toni Morrison's life and legacy. Oprah Winfrey was the last speaker of the evening.
The first time I came face-to-face with Toni Morrison was in Maya Angelou's backyard for a gathering of some of the most illustrious black people you've ever heard of, to celebrate Toni Morrison's Nobel Prize victory. My head and my heart were swirling. Every time I looked at her, I couldn't even speak. I had to catch my breath. And I was seated across from her at dinner, and there was a moment when I saw Miss Morrison just gesture to the waiter for some water, and I almost tripped over myself trying to get up from the table to get it for her. And Maya said, "Sit down." We have people here to do that. You're a guest. So I sat down. I obeyed, of course. But it was not easy, I tell you, to sit still or to keep myself inside my body. I felt like I was all of 7 years old. because after all, she was there. And so many others that day. Mari Evans, Sister Angela Davis was there, Nikki Giovanni was there, Rita Dove was there, Tony Cade Bambara was there. It was a writer's mecca. And I was there, sitting at the table, taking it all in. And as I look back, that day remains one of the great thrills of my life. You know, I didn't really get to speak to Toni Morrison that day. I was just too bedazzled. But I had already previously called her up to ask about acquiring the film rights to Beloved. After I finished reading it, I found her number, called her, and when I asked her, is it true that sometimes people have to read over your work in order to understand it, to get the full meaning? And she bluntly replied, that, my dear, is called reading. I was embarrassed, but that statement actually gave me the confidence years later when I formed the book club on the Oprah Show to choose her work. I chose more of her books than any other author over the years. Song of Solomon first, Sula, The Bluest Eye, and Paradise. And if any one of our viewers ever complained that it was hard-going or challenging reading Toni Morrison, I simply said, that, my dear, is called reading. There was no distance between Toni Morrison and her words. I loved her novels, but lately I've been rereading her essays, which underscore that she was also one of our most influential public intellectuals. In one essay, she said, if writing is thinking and discovery and selection and order and meaning, it is also awe and reverence and mystery and magic. And this, facts can exist without human intelligence, but truth cannot. She thought deeply about the role of the artist and concluded that writers are among the most sensitive, most intellectually anarchic, most representative, most probing of all the artists. She believed it was a writer's job to rip the veil off, to bore down to the truth. She took the canon and she broke it open. Among her legacies, the writers she paved the way for, many of them here in this beautiful space tonight, celebrating her. Toni Morrison was her words. She is her words. For her words often were confrontational. She spoke the unspoken. She probed the unexplored. She wrote of eliminating the white gaze of not wanting to speak for Black people, but wanting to speak to them, to be among all people. Her words don't permit the reader to down them quickly and forget them. We know that. They refuse to be skimmed. They will not be ignored. They can gut you, turn you upside down, make you think you just don't get it. But when you finally do, and you always will when you open yourself to what she is offering, you experience, as I have many times reading Toni Morrison, a kind of emancipation, a liberation, an ascension to another level of understanding. Because by taking us down there amid the pain, the shadows, she urges us to keep going, to keep feeling, to keep trying to figure it all out with her words and her stories as guide and companion. And she asks us to follow our own pain, to reckon with it, and at last to transcend it. And while she's no longer on this earth, her magnificent soul, her boundless imagination, her fierce passion, her gallantry, she told me once, I've always known I was gallant. Who says that? Who even knows they are gallant? well, her gallantry remains always to help us navigate our way through. I'd like to close the evening with an excerpt from Song of Solomon. You know, I have many favorite passages when it comes to Tony's body of work, one that you just shared, Kevin. She's a friend to my mind from Beloved. I love that. Mama, did you ever love us? And the mother's response in Sula. But this one from Song of Solomon never fails to inspire awe for me. And for that and so much else, I say thank you to this singular, monumental, gallant writer. He had come out of nowhere, as ignorant as a hammer, and broke as a convict, with nothing but free papers, a Bible, and a pretty black-haired wife. And in 1 year, he leased 10 acres. The next, 10 more. 16 years later, he had one of the best farms in Montour County, a farm that colored their lives like a paintbrush and spoke to them like a sermon. You see, the farm said to them, see what you can do. You see? Never mind you can't tell one letter from another. Never mind you born a slave. Never mind you lose your name. Never mind your daddy dead. Never mind nothing. Here, this here is what a man can do if he puts his mind to it and his back in it. Stop sniveling, it said. Stop picking round the edges of the world. Take advantage. And if you can't take advantage, take disadvantage. We live here. We live here. On this planet, in this nation, in this county. Can't you see that? Can't you see? We got a home right here in this rock, don't you see? We got a home in this rock, and if I got a home, you got one too. So grab it. Grab this land. Take this land. Hold this land, my brothers. Ain't nobody crying in my home. I want you to take this land, make it, my brothers, shake it, squeeze it, turn it, twist it, beat it, kick it, kiss it, whip it, stomp it, dig it, plow it, seed it, reap it, rent it, buy it, sell it, own it, build it, multiply it, and pass it on. You hear me? Do you hear me? Pass it on. Thank you.
Oprah Winfrey, remembering the great writer Toni Morrison at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in Manhattan. The Nobel and Pulitzer Prize-winning writer died in August at the age of 88. That does it for our show. Tune in to our Thursday and Friday specials. On Thanksgiving, we'll speak to the indigenous scholar and activist Nick Estes, citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe and author of Our History is the Future. Then we'll hear from acclaimed writer Arundhati Roy on the crisis in Kashmir and growing authoritarianism in India and around the world. On Friday, we'll bring you a special hour with the legendary musician and artist David Byrne. He'll talk about his time in the Talking Heads, his years of bike advocacy, reasons to be cheerful, and his new hit Broadway show, American Utopia. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Hani Masood, Trina Nadura, Marie Astudio, and Maria Taracena. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.